All right, it is 1 o'clock, so we are going to get started in just a minute here. Just give people maybe another minute or two to make sure they're on and they can see. We're up to 40 participants.
Let's see. It's a lot of practicalities. This is for my will. This one is contact information for her attorney, and it's interesting. This one is entitled "What I Want."
Okay, I'm gonna go get started. Now, first of all, I am going to acknowledge that we are recording. So if you could please mute your screen or mute your microphone, that will help us. All right, I think I am going to go in. Okay, so I'm going to start by introducing myself. I am Melissa.desimone. I'm the Executive Director of Michigan Lakes and Streams Association. We're very excited to have you here today for the Exotic Aquatic Plant Watch training. We had hoped to offer this training at our annual conference in May, but unfortunately, due to our current health crisis with the COVID-19 pandemic, we have had to cancel that conference. And so we've invited Joe Latimore and Erick Elgin to help us make sure that we can continue our lake monitoring and offer this training. This training is being recorded. If you are interested in sharing this with someone who wasn't able to come today, or you would like to view it again, you will be able to find that on the MLSA website. You can email me for a copy of that. It will be a link that you will be able to go to watch this training again. So in a moment, I'm going to hand the floor over to Joe and Erick for the training, but I want to go over a couple of housekeeping items for you. If you take a look at your screen, at the bottom, you will see a bar, and it will tell you if you're muted. If there's a line through the microphone, that means that you are muted and we cannot hear you. If there is a line through your video, that means that your video is not showing. If there is not a line through your video, we can see you. If things start to slow down for you, if you have trouble seeing what's happening on the screen, I recommend that you turn your video and your microphone off, because that might affect your Wi-Fi capability. So that might be an option for you. The other thing, in order to keep things moving along so that everyone has a chance to ask any questions that they might have, I encourage you to use the chat feature So if you, again, look down on that same bar where the mute and the stop video are located, there is a spot that says chat. It's lit up right now because we have some comments in the chat. You can open it up, you can type a message, and I will be monitoring that throughout the presentation to help Joe and Eric answer any questions you might have. If you take a look at the chat, you can actually find some information that Joe and I have both put in there. I put information about where to find the training video, the training recording, how to contact me. Joe has put information about where to find our information for the 2020 lake monitoring options. Also, coronavirus information, Secchi disk, how to acquire a Secchi disk, and then Joe and Eric's email addresses for contacting them as well. So there's all kinds of information in the chat already. So I encourage you to take a look at that and to type in any questions you might have. There's quite a few people on the call today. It looks like we're up to 57 participants. So I think we're going to rely on the chat for questions because it may get to a point where people are talking over each other if we open up microphones. So with that being said, again, we really appreciate you joining us today. On behalf of MLSA, I turn it over to Joe and Eric.
Hello, everyone.
Hi, everybody. We're really glad to see you here today and have such an excellent turnout. That shows that there's a lot of interest in lake monitoring, which of course we knew to be true. So we'll start out by introducing ourselves a little bit, and then we'll dive into the content for today. I'm Joe Latimore. I'm a faculty member in the Department of Fisheries and Wildlife at Michigan State University. I work out of my home primarily anyway in Traverse City, but also have an office on campus in East Lansing. And I've been involved with the Cooperative Lakes Monitoring Program for the past 15 years, helping share volunteer lake monitoring programs across the state. I've met many of you before in that capacity and others. And I'm joined today by my colleague, Eric.
Thanks, Joe. My name is Erick Elgin. I'm an aquatic ecologist and water resources educator with Michigan State University Extension. I cover a lot of things, lakes from natural shorelines, invasive species, you name it, I've been a part of it. Let's see, so I've been with Extension for just over 3 years, and since I started, I've been a part of my core. So I'm going to share screens. Tell me if I'm successful here in a moment.
You have shared, oh, there it is. It's up.
Does everything
All right.
look okay?
Yeah. So that looks great, Eric, thank you. And Eric and I do a lot of training programs together, and it's our kind of model to switch back and forth so you don't have to listen to one of us for any period of time that's too long. I'm going to kick us off today, but then we're going to break it up into sections. Eric's controlling the slides that you see on your screen, so you may hear me ask him to advance the slides. Other than that, I think we're ready to get started. And as Melissa noted, if you have questions that you think of during the course of our presentation today, feel free to type them into the chat box, and we'll either address them as we go, or of course, we're going to leave time at the end for any questions that you have, and we'll address any questions you have then. So I think we're going to go ahead and get started. So thanks for joining us to talk about lake monitoring in 2020. Next slide, please. So first I want to give you a little history, and for history you need to look at a whole bunch of logos. We're here to talk about lake monitoring in Michigan, and actually for the last 45 years, 46 years now, Michigan has had a volunteer lake monitoring program, and most recently it's been known as the Cooperative Lakes Monitoring Program. So there's 45, 46 years of data in the system collected by volunteers over the past several decades, and it's actually the biggest and most in-depth source of lake data anywhere in Michigan, even compared to lake data collected by the DNR or the EPA or anything else. Volunteers have collected more data than any other organization on Michigan's lakes, so it's an incredibly valuable program. 15 years ago, the state formed a program called the Michigan Clean Water Corps. And for short, we call it MyCore, and many of you have heard of MyCore. That's basically just an umbrella name for programs, including our volunteer stream monitoring program and the cooperative lakes monitoring program. So MyCore is an umbrella that covers stream monitoring and lake monitoring. This year is a little different. Can we back up to the original, the slide that was there? Great. There's one other thing I wanted to say is that all those organizations you see over there on the right are organizations that have been involved with MyCore. So MyCore is kind of owned or housed in the Department of Environment, Great Lakes and Energy, which used to be called the DEQ, Department of Environmental Quality. And then they have partnered with Great Lakes Commission, Huron River Watershed Council, Michigan Lakes and Streams Association, and MSU Extension to cooperate and offer this program to all of you. As you can imagine, it's a pretty complicated program, so it requires a lot of partners to move forward. This year is a little different. So we can move to the next slide. Because of a delay in funding for the Cooperative Lakes Monitoring Program, there actually is no official CLMP or Cooperative Lakes Monitoring Program this summer. But the good news is two things. One, there's funding available to continue the program starting again next year. So really the program is just on hiatus this year. It will come back in full force. We'll be talking about the CLMP again for 2021. In this summer, we're going to be offering a limited lake monitoring program. And you can find all the details about the limited lake monitoring program on the Huron River Watershed Council's website. They're the partner who offered to put up an easy to understand website about what we're offering this year. And if you go to that website at some point, you will see information and an explanation about it. And it'll have parameters listed in 3 different categories. One of them is parameters that are supported this year. And when we say supported, that means that we offer training, we offer support if you have questions, in some cases even offering site visits coming out to your lake. We'll talk more about that in a little bit. And the parameters that are supported in 2020 are Secchi disc and the exotic aquatic plant watch. So you're in the training for that right now. The second category of parameters are ones that you can continue on your own in 2020. Now those are parameters that we're not offering any official training for, but if you've been doing them in the past, you can keep doing them this year. That includes parameters like score the shore, and dissolved oxygen and temperature monitoring if you have your own meter, and a few others. So those are programs you can continue on your own. And then finally, there's 2 parameters that the partners involved with the monitoring program are not offering this year. And that's total phosphorus and chlorophyll. So those water quality parameters that require the state of Michigan laboratory to analyze those samples. We don't have access to the laboratory this year because of that being on a hiatus year this year. So we can't offer or support those programs. Some lakes are choosing to hire someone else to a different lab to do those programs for them. And if that is something of interest to you, you can find information on how to find an external lab to analyze samples for you on this webpage hosted by the Huron River Watershed Council. What we're here today to talk about is the parameters that are supported in 2020. So again, that's Secchi disc monitoring and the exotic aquatic plant watch. Next slide, please. So we would be irresponsible if we didn't quickly mention the current conditions that we're under, where we need to be safe regarding coronavirus. And so our message to you is simple: don't be silly, follow the state guidelines. You know, we're under the stay home, stay safe, save lives executive order here in Michigan, which means non-essential travel should not be undertaken. But it specifically also says you can go outside. You can go outside for exercise. You can go outside to get fresh air. I know I've been taking advantage of those opportunities to get outside. The sun's even out here in Traverse City today. So, you know, that does mean that if handled wisely, lake monitoring can occur, but just be sure to follow the recommendations offered by the state of Michigan and by the CDC, maintaining social distancing and so forth. You know, that's just a wise recommendation for all of us during these times. And we've included the link to the state of Michigan's coronavirus information site, and that's where we refer everyone who has questions or concerns about what they should and shouldn't be doing during these unprecedented times. I think at this point I can hand it over to Erick.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm gonna get us started with water transparency and Secchi disk. I'm gonna keep my video off because my internet at home is a little slow. So please put in a chat if I'm bogged down. Water transparency is a really important parameter to collect on lakes and is very simple to collect with a Secchi disk. And so that's what you see this individual in this picture doing, is he's holding a Secchi disk at the end of that rope or that chain there. And that allows us to use a standard method to collect water clarity, water transparency across lakes. Water clarity is really important in lakes because it provides a lot of clues onto what's happening. So there's immediate things that, you know, the lake, the more aesthetically pleasing it is to us. But there's also other the condition of the water and condition of the lake. So when we look at Secchi disk, oftentimes we look at a graph like you see here. I'm going to move my cursor. Hopefully you can see that. So as you can see, the zero depth is up top, meaning if Secchi disk was close to that zero line, it would be very low water clarity. And if you go up here, it'd be 15 feet deep of water clarity, so you're having a lot clearer conditions. And then this up here is where we're looking through time. And so you can see in May, in this particular lake that I have here, we have 15 plus feet of water clarity, but then you can see this decline into the middle of the summer, late summer, and then once again kind of increase, but not to what it was in the spring. So this data can really provide clues. For example, what do you think is happening here in the months of July and August? This is the warmth of the summer. This is likely going to be potential higher algae concentrations. But interesting enough, when we collect this, you know, we see this lower water clarity in this particular lake that I worked on. We saw some indications of this, and we went out and collected. It wasn't algae; it was actually suspended solids that is released into the water column, reaching water clarity. And so we can get these indications here. And now, not just through the season, it can also give us a lot of information through time, through the years. So here's a lake that I've worked on that has 40 years of data. Most of it is from the Cooperative Lakes Monitoring Program, but some of it also from the EPA to fill in some gaps. What's interesting here, you can see in the 70s and early 80s, water clarity was quite low. So we have a Secchi disk reading of under 5 feet. But then very dramatically after this red dashed line, we get a lot higher water clarity. And that's, although we have a gap in data for a few years, it came back with volunteer monitoring, and we have very similar to what it was back after this action. So this red dashed line was a management action that occurred on the lake. And what's interesting is now we're using Secchi disk to see, did management work? So did this particular action work on the lake? And without collecting this data, we wouldn't know. And so lo and behold, the management action worked. We have better water clarity in this lake, which was one of the goals. But now collecting data also can tell us some of the negatives too. So here's from Perch Lake in Otsego County, where in the early 80s, we had water clarity around that 14 feet deep. And then there, again, the gap in collection, but then volunteers collected once again in the 2000s, and we saw that there's a decline in water clarity. But that's important to know, because then you know is what that might spur action in saying what's going on, maybe we can address it. And then one more thing about water clarity, water transparency, is that it has lots of other impacts as well. For example, to property values. A study out of Wisconsin showed that a 3-foot improvement in water clarity produced an improvement in the market price of an average property in lakes with low water clarity. So just a 3-foot increase can increase the property. So how do we measure? How do we measure water clarity with Secchi disk? So what you can see here is a Secchi disk. And what happens is it gets lowered into the water and light is reflected back off of it, and you can read the depth that it's in. If there is not a lot of particles floating in the water or a lot of dissolved substances, you can see really deep. But now if there's more particles in the water, that blocks the sunlight and reflects it back up, and so you will have a lower water clarity, and so more cloudy water. So let's go down to the protocol. This is what's nice about this technique is that it's very, very simple to follow. So first, you want to drift your boat approximately over because in case you have if you're in a shallow lake, you don't want to kick up any sediments. But so you want to, so that's why you drift and shoot. So you cut your motor, drift into the deepest part of the lake, and then once you're stopped, you slowly lower your disc until it disappears from view. And then you note that. And then you slowly raise it up. This is very slowly until the disc reappears, and you note that number. And then you pretty much have it. Now, you take the average of those two depths, and that's your official Secchi disc measure, rounded to the ½ foot. A couple things to note is don't use sunglasses. There is some variability with all of our eyes. However, if we use certain, if we follow certain protocols, we can be a lot more specific. So polarized lenses, obviously you can see it further down in the water, so we don't want that. So you need to have no sunglasses on. Another thing is to pick the shadow side of the lake and not the sunny side. Reflect off the water, and so to be it needs to be on the shadow side. Of course, if it's that side, whichever side, and just try to be consistent when with your measurements on when you collect them through the summer. We don't want to collect this in the dark, of course, and we don't want to collect it when the sun is low or high in the sky. So trying to pick the time to make the time span on Secchi disc reading between 10 and 4. So we require 8 measurements across the entire summer for Secchi disc, and this is because lakes change through the season, and Secchi disc can tell us different things throughout that season. So for example, what you see in this picture is the seasonal succession of Lake algae in a lake that has moderate nutrients in it. And what you can see is in the springtime, different algae are growing than what's happening in the late summer. So for example, diatoms are blooming in the springtime, where in the later summer months, we have blue-green algae. And so we want to capture all this variability to get a sense of what's happening in the lake. We do have data sheets available. That's on that Huron River Watershed Council website that Joe talked about, and we're going to be flashing up on the screen multiple times. Also found in the chat already that Joe put up. What you do is try to get these intervals between May 10th through the 16th, try to get MBT depth and any notes, so weather conditions and any unusual conditions. Is it really windy, for example? The rest of the data sheet, we just like to note where did you collect this data. So if that's, and the depth, the approximate depth. So in this example, 65 feet around that area. It doesn't have to be very precise, but just to have an idea. And just to kind of round out all this is different from years past is enrollment fees. We will be providing technical support, so you can contact Joe, myself, I believe probably Paul Steen or any part of our older MyCore team. The data sheets can be found at the Huron River Watershed Council's website. And what we're asking you to do is hold on to your data sheets. We can't upload them into our database because right now we don't have that contract with the state. But what we're hopeful for is that we can get that information into the database once it's up and running in later on in 2020 or in 2021. So hold on to your data sheets, and hopefully we'll be able to incorporate them. If you need a Secchi disc, you can get them online easily, but MLSA has made it easy by, if you just go to their website, you can find a link to where you can get them, I believe, on Amazon. You do have to pay for them, but that information is on MLSA's website. Very cheap. If you want more procedures and training videos, you can find them for Secchi discs. You can find them at the Huron River Watershed Council's website.
All right, we have a couple of questions.
Perfect.
Debbie asks, why are measurements taken at the deepest part of the lake?
Yeah, so a couple reasons. The reason between lakes across the landscape. So when you are next to a creek or river inlet, that can be bringing sediments into the water, which adds variability to what the water clarity is. And so to kind of get an overall average water clarity in that water body, we do the deepest part of the lake.
Okay, and then also, can we make this PowerPoint available as well?
Just the pure PowerPoint with no recording? I think we can.
Okay. All right, and then Michelle mentioned about interruptions, and yes, there's been a little bit of interruptions in what Eric was saying. I'm hoping that the recording will not reflect that, but we'll see about that. So I apologize for that.
Is there any place you need me to?
I think Eric was asking if there's anything you would like him to repeat. All right. Okay, that was all I saw in the chat.
Okay, excellent. Now I'm going to hand it over to Joe.
Okay, great. And I'll just mention, yeah, I'm hearing the challenges with some of Eric's audio as well. So we're planning to have him speak one more time, and we'll give that a try. But if he continues to break up, I can pick up wherever that gets left off. So, and those audio challenges will occur in the recording as well. So we want to talk next about the Exotic Aquatic Plant Watch. The exciting thing about the Exotic Aquatic Plant Watch for this year is that for several years, MSU has had a separate contract with the state of Michigan to run this part of the Cooperative Lakes Monitoring Program, and that funding still exists, which means that Eric and I continue to be available to support this program, to offer training, to help you identify plants that you find, and so forth. So we're still actively promoting this program and are going to be available to help out and support you if you decide to do this monitoring this year. Next slide, please. So the Exotic Aquatic Plant Watch, some of you have done this before. For some of you, I know this is brand new. It's designed as an early detection survey for aquatic invasive plants in our lakes. The focus on this parameter is on plants in the lake. So it doesn't include plants like Phragmites or purple loosestrife, things that grow on the land around the shoreline. We developed this program several years ago to support monitoring of those plants that really no one was out looking for, except for some professionals. We wanted our volunteers to have a better sense of what some of these invasive species look like so they could detect them early. What we know from the study of aquatic invasive species is that the sooner you find it, the better the chances you have of getting rid of it. That's eradication. It also means management will be easier. If you find a patch of an invasive plant in your lake that's only, 30 feet by 30 feet, there's a lot of management options available to you, and you may be able to remove it altogether from your lake. But if you don't notice it and no one catches it until you have 30 acres of that invasive plant in your lake, then that's going to be a lot more expensive and a lot more difficult to manage. And there's a really good chance that you won't be able to get rid of it completely. And so we designed the Exotic Aquatic Plant Watch as a tool for citizens to use to go out and, you know, poke around in their lake, look for some of these troublesome invaders, and, you know, be well equipped to identify them and report them if you do find them. Next slide. So first thing we want to do today is talk to you about how to do the Exotic Aquatic Plant Watch. And the next slide will show us where do we start. So we like to recommend that people look in their lakes, particularly in locations where the risk of having an invasive plant introduced is the highest. So if you'll see the movement of my cursor on the screen, well, actually you won't see it because this is Erick's screen. What the map shows is that there are a couple of boat ramps there, and thank you, Erick, is pointing those out. There's a couple of boat ramps where boats on trailers and people entering the lake may be inadvertently transporting weeds that they snagged in a different lake and introducing them into your lake. So that is a high-risk area. Other high-risk areas would be public beaches and parks, maybe an inlet where a stream might flow into or out of your lake, which may introduce invasives from other locations, and also quiet bays and coves. I think any of you who have spent any time on a lake tend to notice that in those quiet bays and coves, the plant life is usually more lush and happy in those sheltered areas. So those are places where we may also see invasive species appearing. And then you can be adaptable. So what we recommend is that you definitely survey in those high-risk areas. And if you wish, you can fill in the gaps between those areas. Like you see in the upper left-hand corner, there's a big open area where there's no surveying happening. You could add some transects or imaginary sampling lines in your lake for looking for invasive species. So when we say transects, what we're talking about is what's indicated by these red lines. Basically, develop or maybe even draw on a map an invisible line going from the shoreline out into the water, maybe to about 15 feet in depth. And you would sample at 2 or 3 points along that line, in the shallows, in the medium kind of depth areas, and down into the deeper areas, because different plants do better in different depths. Now we have a rule of thumb on the recommended number of transects based on the surface area of your lake. Our rule of thumb is that if your lake is less than 100 acres in size, 5 to 15 survey transects is likely going to give you a good sense of what species might be in your lake. As your lake gets bigger, if you have 100 to 500 acres, maybe 15 to 30 transects. If you have a really big lake, bigger than 500 acres, maybe 30 to 50 transects. But these surveys are adaptable. Again, we recommend focusing your efforts initially on those high-risk areas. Those are those high priority areas where you should be looking, especially those boat ramps. Those tend to be really high-risk areas. And then, given how much time and volunteer help you have, filling in with more transects around your lake. Some really large lakes even decide to break it up over several years and maybe do the north side of the lake in 1 year and the second year do the south side of the lake, and then continue to keep that survey activity going. Next slide. Our collecting tool is this high-tech sampling rake that you can build yourself. Sampling rakes, the ones we use when Erick and I go out in the field, look exactly like this, and we built them. Take a couple of gardening rakes, cut the handles off of them. You can use an eye bolt screwed into the head of one of the rakes and attach a rope. And then use some C-bolts and clamps to brace those two together. And you can imagine that a rake like this is really effective at pulling up weeds from the bottom of a lake. If you've ever pulled up your anchor when you're out fishing in a weedy lake, you know that it does a good job. So you can imagine that a rake like this with all these tongs would do even better. Be sure that the rope is attached really securely to the rake head. More than once, I have seen people throw their rake out and only have the rope when they are done. They sink really well, and using a clip or something like that that can get stuck open is not recommended. You want to tie that on real well. We've also included here on this slide a helpful illustration of what we mean by transects. I talked about this a little bit on the last slide, but you can see here a photograph of an actual boat ramp from the satellite view, and you can see that transect that goes from the lake shore out to about 15 feet deep. And you can throw a rake off your boat at about 3 feet deep, again at about 8 feet, and at about 15. And you'll inspect whatever plants come up on that rake and record them on your data sheet. Next slide, please. So here's a photograph of one of our hardy volunteers out doing some sampling. He's got some excellent rake tossing form there. You don't have to throw your arm out of socket to get a good sample, but just simply tossing underhand from the side of the boat, being safe, of course. This is a heavy, pointy weapon if used incorrectly. So just toss it over the side of your boat, let it hit the bottom, and then drag it kind of slowly back up to shore, snagging plants along the way. Next slide. Another important consideration is thinking about when you want to sample. And really the most important part is to be out on your lake when the plants are abundant. During the peak of the growing season, you know, June, July, August are all good times. You may see that July and August are when you have the most plant growth. June, especially mid to late June, can also be a useful time to be out sampling, especially when you're looking for the invasive plant curly-leaf pondweed. Curly-leaf pondweed tends to grow early in the season. That's one of the adaptations it has that makes it a great invader. And it's a little harder to find later in the summer. However, many of the other plants might be harder to find in June. So that's gives you, again, we're mentioning there's flexibility in this. You also have to think about when you're available, when you can safely get out on the water. If you have a really busy recreational lake, maybe you don't want to go out when there's tons of other boat traffic out there, that kind of thing. So June, July, and August are all good times to do this survey. Next slide. We mentioned earlier the data sheet for this program, and it's really important to fill out data forms for yourself, for your own records, but also for us, for the program. We want to track the success of our volunteers and report any invasive species that are new to an area or to a lake, and have that data available to enter into our database. And if it's a high-risk species or something new that hasn't been known from that lake before, it's important for us to have that, and we can also help get that data reported to the state of Michigan, who may be able to provide guidance or assistance in managing that invasive species. So you can see at the top, again, we've included that same link to the Huron River Watershed Council's website. This is where you can download and print out copies of the data sheets for this year. At the top of the data sheet is just what you see here on the screen. You just enter some very basic information, the name of your lake, who was out there volunteering to collect these samples, when you were out, and any unusual conditions. Next slide. The bottom half of the data sheet actually tells you when to enter, where to enter the information of what species you found. And you'll see right in the center there, below the list of species that we focus on in this program, there is a list of things to include in your report. So it includes this completed data form. We're looking at page 1 right now, and you'll see page 2 on the next slide. Also a lake map. We'll show you some examples of lake maps for this program, and then any photographs that you have taken of the collected plants. I see a question in the chat box about whether we're considering developing a phone app for recording and reporting data while in the field, and that's a really great question. Yes, we are considering it. I wouldn't expect to see that for at least another year, again, because this year being kind of on hiatus with the overall CLMP program. We are just working to maintain the baseline of what we've been able to do in the past. But in the future, it's on our to-do list to start developing phone apps to help make it easier for you, especially those of us who don't use paper and pen as much as we used to offer an option of a phone app. So that's a great question. A couple important things to note regarding this data form is it's really important to still turn in a report if you don't find any invasive species. Eric, could you click for me? Yeah, so see that star? If you don't find any invasive plants, we still want you to turn in the report to show us where you looked and to share the good news that you didn't find any invasive species. So you would simply check that box or put a big red star there, that's fine too. And that will help us and for you to know where you looked this year for invasive plants. That way, if things change in the future, you'll know whether it's a brand new invasion or not. When you are done with your reports, we actually do want these turned into us. Rather than just having you hold on to them as we are for Secchi and any other monitoring you're doing, we actually would like you to turn in your data to us. And so the contact information for me is there at the bottom of the data form for quick and easy reference. When you're done with your survey, you can email it to me, scan it, send me a photograph, or just pop it in the mail and send it off to me at MSU. Next slide. Here's an example of the second page of the report. And this is the second page of what you can download from the Watershed Council website. And what this is a table to document the results of your survey. What we're looking for here is the transect number. So you're going to make a map and number your transects 1 through however many. You can give the latitude and longitude if you have GPS on your phone or a GPS unit, or if you have a GPS on your boat. Or you can write a description. If there's a landmark or something that you're using rather than GPS coordinates, you can write that in there instead. One thing we do ask on your data form or on your map, it can be really tempting to just put the names of the people's houses that you're in front of, but these data are publicly available and we can't include people's names on them. So if every description is in front of the Smith's cottage and in front of the Johnson's house, I actually have to go through manually and redact all that information from the form. So if you can describe it as like the blue house or even an address, that's fine, but try to avoid using people's names. The next column, the fourth column you see there, is the list of any exotic plants found. The person who filled this out used abbreviations, CLP for curly leaf pondweed, EWM for Eurasian watermilfoil, but you can also write out the names of the species there, or write none if you didn't find any. There's a place to notice if you took and included any photos from that site, yes or no. And there's also a place for notes. Here, the volunteer wrote that the plants in that location were very sparse. Sometimes people will note particular native plants they see or other interesting or unusual characteristics of that location under notes. So the third part, after the data sheet, pages 1 and 2, would be providing a map showing both you and us where you actually looked for the plants. So there's several different ways you can do this. This is an example of someone who printed out, made a copy of a map of their lake and simply drew on there and wrote numbers. So we knew exactly where they had been looking. And you can do that by hand. That's the easy, low-tech way of doing this. This map is actually an example of a map among the many inland lake maps that the DNR has on their website. So that's one place to look if you don't have a map of your lake. There's also several mapping options for use on the computer. This one was generated by a volunteer who used Google Earth to make a map of their lake, and you can see they made little pins, diagram on a satellite photograph of their lake that showed us where on Brooks Lake they looked for invasive species. Next slide. And here's another example of using Google Maps to make a map of where they surveyed. This one's kind of interesting because you can see they wrote in descriptions by entering in the latitude and longitude from their GPS when they were out on the lake. This person actually kayaks around their lake and she takes her GPS unit with her, takes notes about the locations where she tossed her rake, and then she actually entered the data right into the Google map. So you can see, for example, the very first one there, if you can look closely, it says log cabin dock. It has the coordinates and also includes the fact that she found lots of curly leaf pondweed there on June 25th. So there's a lot of different ways. We're very flexible. We just want some kind of map so we know where you looked in the lake for invasive plants. Next slide, please. The last thing on that initial data sheet for your report is any photographs that you want to include. We really heavily recommend including photographs for a number of reasons. Taking photographs of the plants that you find makes an excellent record for you to remember what those various plants look like. It also allows you to be able to share this with others. Other people on your lake and your community might be really interested to see the kinds of plants that you are finding. They might also have questions about the plants that they're finding in front of their own dock and down on their property or down at the public beach or by the boat launch. And so having some photographs of those plants included is really useful for you. It's also extremely useful for us, for Eric and I, because we are happy to help you identify plants that you're not sure about. If you have a plant that you're not sure, and we're going to talk about plant ID here in a minute, but if you have a plant that you're unsure about and you want us to take a look, you know, back several years ago, the only way we could really help you is have you mail us the plant, and we'd get wet envelopes full of soggy weeds and decomposing plants, and it wasn't pleasant, but it was the best thing we had. Now, because we all have digital photographs usually right in our pocket with a phone or a simple digital camera, it's easy to take photographs. And in the chat box, Bonnie asked about taking photos of invasive and native plants, and you're certainly welcome to do that and submit those. It's again a good record for you, and if you want to honestly to prove to us that you knew what you were talking about when you said, oh, I have Eurasian milfoil, and then you send us a picture that's clearly not Eurasian milfoil, we can help you out and say, hey, guess what? Good news, the plant that you thought was Eurasian milfoil actually looks like native milfoil to us. So we welcome photographs. Feel free to send them to us. A few tips about taking good photos is that if they're blurry, they're not helpful to us. You know, we have to look, and you'll learn this here in our identification section, you have to look at details on the plant. And if the photos are blurry, they're not terribly valuable. You also want to include photos of key characteristics. For example, in milfoils, many of you know, and we'll talk about this in a minute, being able to count the leaflets, or the little that we're seeing with our cursor here, those little divisions on every leaf of the milfoil leaf, we want to be able to count those. And so if we can't see them in the photo, that makes it difficult. It's also important to show the scale and the location on your pictures. So having something that shows us how big the plant is helpful. You can see a ruler here, and you can also even write on the photo or indicate somewhere the location where that photo was taken. On the next slide, we have a couple more examples of some of these photos that volunteers have sent in to us. On the left, you see a photo that was sent in by a volunteer on Lotus and Mesa Day Lakes in Oakland County. This is curly leaf pondweed, and this photo showed clearly the wavy leaf structure and such that we needed to see to confirm for her that that was indeed curly leaf pondweed. On the right, we have a photograph of a native plant, Elidea, that looks a lot like invasive hydrilla. And you can see they took a photo that shows the whole plant and then also shows a whorl of leaves. You'll see those in a minute, that shows that there's 3 leaves. And that's a distinguishing characteristic of Elidea that helped us to confirm for them that it was not invasive hydrilla, but was instead a native plant. Next slide. If you don't have a handy ruler, even taking a picture of the plant in your hand will do. As you can see, that really helps us see the size of and features of the plant that you're looking at. Because if it's just a bunch of green stuff taking up the whole field of the photo, it can be hard for us to tell if we're looking at something very large or something very small. So even having a photo of the plant in your hand will help us out. Next slide, please. So some final details about participating in the Exotic Aquatic Plant Watch this year. This is the only aspect of monitoring this year that we're asking you to sign up for in advance. If you're doing Secchi disc, if you're deciding to do our Score the Shore program, if you're already trained in that, anything like that is on your own this year. But for Exotic Aquatic Plant Watch, we want to know if you're planning to do it. And several of you on the call today, I know, have already notified me that you're planning to do this. We want it for a couple of reasons. We want to be able to follow up with you to make sure that you have all the resources you need to be successful this year. We want to be able to gather the data at the end of the season. So we'll reach out to everybody at the end if we haven't gotten reports from you. If you indicated that you were planning to do it, you can let us know, and then we'll reach out to you at the end of the season to gather your data and hopefully include it in the CLMP database once that program is back up and running. And also, you know, throughout the season, as I mentioned before, Eric and I are available to you to help you with plant identification. We can look at photographs, we can answer questions over the phone or email. Sometimes, we're not promising this, but sometimes people will even email us questions or text us from the boat. You're out there on the boat and you have a photograph and you send us a quick email. If we happen to be sitting at our desk, we might be able to respond to you before you're even done with your survey. No promises, but it could happen. And then finally, depending on the situation related to coronavirus, if we're able to travel and get out into the field this summer, we also have resources to provide limited lake visits. It's been our priority over the last several years for lakes who have never done the exotic plant watch before to identify a few lakes each summer to actually go out and visit you, go out on the lake with you, help you identify plants and kind of get you started on your survey. So we're hoping to be able to do that. But the only way we know that you're planning to do it is if you sign up with us. So I think so far we've got almost 40 lakes that have signed up so far, and we appreciate that notification so we can stay in touch with you and support you. At this point, I think we're going to transition over to plant identification, unless anybody has any questions they want to post right now in the chat about the actual monitoring procedure. Wait a second for that before I switch back to Eric. And Eric, I'll let you know if we're having trouble with your audio, because we can always switch back and I can cover this too.
Thank you. I'm realizing, I think when I switch the slides, it takes a while, and that takes whatever the bandwidth of internet away from my voice.
Well, it was happening just then too. So
okay.
The only reason. I see a question from Sue. Is once a month, June, July, and August, the recommended frequency? That's a really good question. And the answer is no. You really only need to survey your lake once at any point during the summer. Some people find that they break it up and they'll do a couple spots every week during the course of the summer, but you're certainly not expected to survey your entire lake multiple times in a single season. You know, if I was an ideal lake and I was, you know, had access to my boat and I had people that were willing to help me around July 15th, I'd say, hey, let's go out and do the whole thing on July 15th and maybe over into July 16th, you'll have it done for the year and you'll be good. But some people choose to spread out that effort across the course of the season, either because of the time it takes or availability of others on the lake who are interested in helping you out. You're welcome to visit a spot more than once during the summer, and we'll accept that data too, but don't feel like you have to do that. I don't see any other questions in the chat. So Eric, do you want to give it a shot?
Yes, if it's not working.
I'm not sure that it's working. So maybe I'll just do plant identification, because this part is part where we want to make sure that everyone.
Thank you.
You're welcome. That everyone can hear what we're saying and that we don't break up. So we're going to talk you through plant identification. Bear with me if I stutter a little bit, because this section is the section that Eric wrote for himself. But we've both covered this information a lot over the past several years. So let's go ahead and get started. Plant identification. So it's really important to know what you're dealing with. And these are the 5 plants that are part of the Exotic Aquatic Plant Watch. And so we are, as I mentioned before, looking at plants that are either under the water, like submerged plants, or plants that float on the surface. So when we started this program back in about 2006, the first 4 plants were the plants that we focused on: Eurasian watermilfoil, curly-leaf pondweed, starry stonewort, and hydrilla. All 4 of those plants, the first 3 are fairly common in Michigan now. Hydrilla has never been found in Michigan, but it is in surrounding states. And then more recently, we added European frogbit, and that's the plant that's photographed here. This is a relatively new plant that floats on the surface, and we'll show you lots of photos of it here in a moment. Up until recently, it was really only known from the Lake Huron side of the state and Lake Huron and connecting waters, but has recently appeared in inland lakes on the west side of the state. So we've added that as the 5th target plant. And so we'll go through each of these plants in turn. Next slide, please. So number 1, exotic is Eurasian watermilfoil. Many of you already have this plant in your lake. And so we're very interested in continuing to monitor for this plant, not only to find out where it is new, but also a lot of lakes are tracking very carefully the spread of this plant across their lakes. There's some really key characteristics, and again, many of you have seen this plant before, but milfoils have very feather-like leaves. They're whorled, meaning that multiple leaves attach to the stem at a single spot. And one of the key characteristics for telling native milfoils, of which we have several, from invasive Eurasian milfoil is the number of pairs of leaflets on a single leaf. And you can see that in front of the finger there on the photograph. Eurasian watermilfoil has lots of leaflets, 12 to 21 pairs on every leaf. So that feather has lots and lots of little leaflets coming out of it. Another key characteristic of Eurasian watermilfoil is the fact that when it's removed from the water, it tends to go very limp. Many of our native milfoils will stay stiff and the leaves poking out from the stem when you pull it out, but Eurasian watermilfoil will get limp and kind of fall limply into your hand. Next slide. Can I get the next slide? There it is. Okay, so here's a great example of the whorls. You see 4 leaves, which is the typical number of leaves that are attached to the stem. And native milfoil there on your left has far fewer pairs of leaflets on any single leaf. It almost looks like if a little kid drew a Christmas tree, or even fish bones, spread out. There's less than 12 pairs there for sure. The Eurasian milfoil, the invasive one, you can see on the right, has way more pairs of leaflets. 12 to 21 is what we typically see. So that is a key characteristic to look for. One of the things that we do see now more than ever is hybridization between native and Eurasian milfoil. And some of you may have heard of this. We're getting these kind of mixed breed milfoils in our inland lakes. Which has come to our attention initially because the herbicides that were being used to control Eurasian milfoil suddenly started to be ineffective in killing milfoil, and no one knew why for a short time. And so genetic tests on that difficult to kill milfoil revealed that it wasn't purely Eurasian milfoil, but actually a hybrid between native milfoil, the species northern milfoil, and the invasive Eurasian milfoil. And because of the genetic differences that this hybrid has, some of our herbicides are not effective in controlling it. And so a fair amount of research is going in to better understand hybrid milfoils. But for your activities in the Exotic Aquatic Plant Watch, what this means is a tricky situation, because hybrid milfoils typically cannot be identified just by looking at them. They have characteristics that are sort of like native milfoil and sort of like Eurasian milfoil. So what we recommend is that if you suspect that it's Eurasian milfoil, even if some of the leaves have fewer leaflets on them, but it's growing aggressively, it still has made you concerned, you can certainly report it as Eurasian milfoil. You can send us photographs to take a look at it. We're happy to talk to you about it. But the only way to really know if you're dealing with a hybrid milfoil is through genetic testing. And lake management companies can help connect you with that service, and we can help with that as well.
There was a question specifically about the hybrid milfoil and whether that is considered invasive then or not. What is the status of that?
Thanks, Melissa. Well, because it's partly Eurasian milfoil, yes. It typically does grow in a aggressive and invasive way. It tends to be problematic and, as I mentioned before, difficult to control. And which also makes it a nuisance species of concern. So yes, it's invasive, and because it's harder to control, it can end up feeling even more invasive than Eurasian milfoil. I also see a question about parrot feather. That's another species of milfoil that is also invasive. Will we include that in our program in the future? We're going to talk about some of those new invasives at the end of the talk, so I'll hit on that then. I've got a few photographs here, and normally if we were in a group, we would ask people to raise their hands or answer, but I'm just going to talk you all through it. So first, looking at that photograph in the upper left-hand corner, ask yourself, does that look like Eurasian milfoil? And what I would tell you is that no, that is not Eurasian milfoil. And the reason that I know is by looking at the leaves. You can see that it's a whorl of leaves, just like milfoils have, but they're not in that feather-like arrangement. There's not a central midrib with leaflets coming off. What you're seeing there is a forked leaf that looks like a wishbone or a peace sign. This plant is actually coontail, the native coontail plant that many of us see in our lakes. But you can tell the difference from what we saw before. It's not a feather-like shape. Now let's look at the lower left corner there. This is just a single leaf. And think about, does this look like milfoil? And I would say no. And there's a couple of reasons why that leaf is not milfoil. First of all, it doesn't have that very simple structure of a midrib with leaflets coming off. Instead, it seems like there's definitely leaflets, and they're branched and then branched again and then branched again and branched again. Milfoil doesn't do that. You'll also see small structures along that midrib of the leaf. Those are bladders. This is actually a leaf of the bladderwort plant, a native plant in our lakes that also has a long ropey appearance like milfoil does. But when you look closely, if you really take a look at the actual leaf, you'll see that no, this isn't a feather-like leaf like a milfoil. Now the large picture on your right, is this Eurasian milfoil? It certainly has the long ropey stem. It has whorls of 4 leaves coming off at different nodes along the stem. But the next step is what? It's to look at the number of leaflets that you have on every leaf. And if we count these, I can see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, maybe 9 pairs of leaflets, not the 12 to 21 that we expect for our Eurasian milfoil. So again, the answer is no. This is not Eurasian milfoil. This is actually a native milfoil because it has far fewer pairs of leaflets than Eurasian would. Next slide. And ta-da, here is Eurasian milfoil. Just as a reminder of what it looks like, a nice photo from it in the water where you can see the whorls of leaves, the feather-like leaf structure, and the many, many pairs of leaflets on each leaf. All right, moving on from milfoils, let's talk about the second one on our list. This is curly-leaf pondweed. We have many species of native pondweeds in Michigan, and they're beautiful, beneficial plants. But this is one that's an invader, curly-leaf pondweed. And lucky for us, it's got some very distinctive characteristics that make it quite easy to determine when compared to any of our native pondweeds. The first thing is to look at, in that upper left-hand corner, you can see the leaves look like lasagna. If you look at the edges, they're rippled. That's where it gets its name. Curly leaf pondweed. It has really tight ripples along the edges of the leaves. And you'll also see in the photo right below that, if you look real closely, and in some cases you might want a magnifying glass or hand lens to take a close look, the leaf edges are serrated. No other pondweed has these teeth or serrations on the edges of the leaves. When I'm out in the field, often what I'll do is I'll take the leaf and I'll stretch it across my fingertip, so then I can really see the edge of the leaf really clearly, and I'll be able to see those serrations or teeth. Overall, the leaves are 2 to 3 inches long, about 1/4 to 3/8 of an inch wide. The leaves are alternate, meaning that they come off the stem not at the same spot like milfoil whorls, but there's a leaf maybe coming off to the left, and you move down the stem, another leaf coming off to the right, in this alternating arrangement. That arrangement is actually common to all pondweeds. So really looking at that leaf shape and looking at the teeth on the leaves is very important. Next slide, please. So again, we have some test questions for you. So let's look at this plant up here on the left. The bottom and top are the same plant. So the plant on the left here, ask yourself, is this curly leaf pondweed? And you look and you see it does have alternate leaves on the stem, leaves coming off at different points along the stem. And you can see that the leaves are kind of wavy, but do they really look like lasagna to you? Not really. You can see that they are wavy, but they don't have that really rigid ripple along the top. And if you look really closely, especially at the photo at the top, you can see the edges of those leaves are nice and smooth. There's no teeth there, no serrations. So this is a native pondweed. It's not curly pondweed. Let's look at the photo on the right. Is this curly leaf pondweed? Again, no, it's not. You see it's also got alternating leaves coming off the stem at different points along the stem. But again, the leaves here are not even wavy, let alone curly. And the edges are, again, nice and smooth. So neither of these are the invasive curly leaf pondweed. They're both native pondweeds. Here's curly leaf pondweed. Again, take a close look. You can see that nice strong rippling on the edges of the leaves like lasagna, and you can also see those teeth. Next slide, please. Take a little drink here. All right, the third plant on our watch list is starry stonewort. Starry stonewort is a relatively new invader to Michigan and the lakes. It's been marching northward every year, and so this is one where we really want people to be vigilant. We are still determining the best ways to manage starry stonewort. So the best defense is detecting it early when there isn't much in your lake yet.
And then we actually had a question about what month is most easy to identify starry stonewort as well.
We'll get to it. Thanks.
Oh, okay. Sorry, I just.
No, you're great. So yeah, so starry stonewort is actually an algae. If you can believe it. Look at it in this picture, you wouldn't think maybe that this is an algae, but it is. It's called a type of macro algae or large algae that grows in a form that looks very much like a plant, but it's actually algae. It grows in this branching form with long, uneven branchlets throughout its growth of different lengths. The way it gets its name is from these tiny star-shaped tan or white bulbils. Those are little reproductive structures. And they're produced on what are called rhizoids or clear filaments. To me, when I pull it out, it looks like they're growing on fishing line. You'll have the green body of the algae, and then they'll be usually on the underside, you'll have clear filaments that look a lot like clear fishing line. And you'll see these star-shaped bulbils. No other living thing that you're going to find in your lake is going to have star-shaped bulbils like this. You might see white balls, little spheres, things like that, but you won't see stars. Overall, the starry stonewort has very smooth branchlets, and it's also brittle. It'll break apart and feel brittle in your hands. Next slide. This slide shows a photo of starry stonewort growing underwater. You can see these very uneven length branchlets or branches on the plant. They're not all the same, which helps you, another characteristic that helps you determine it from any native macroalgae that are growing in your lake, because there are others that are fairly common. Next slide, please. So here's an example of such a plant. I'm sure many of you have seen muskgrass or chara in your lake. It tends to have a similar growth form. It's long, it's branching, but it will never have star-shaped bulbils. It often will smell skunky or musky. You can see there down at the bottom, some folks taking a good sniff of the plants they pulled up from the bottom of their lake to see if it's starry or not. If it smells really skunky, that's a clue that it's not starry stonewort. The branches are shorter than starry stonewort, if you recall from the previous slide. And it will also feel rough in your hand. Muskgrass or chara tends to be kind of crisp and crunchy. And so you'll feel that kind of rough feel, while starry stonewort will feel more delicate or brittle in your hands. Next slide. And while that native Cara is often found in very shallow water out into depths, another lookalike native that you might find in your lake is called Nutella. And there's several species of Nutella that grow in Michigan lakes. It's another macroalgae. Again, it will never have the star bulbils on it. And again, the branches of Nutella are even in length. You won't see a short one and a long one and that uneven, almost messy look that starry stonewort has. So you can see this photo here. Now, to the question about what month is starry stonewort easiest to identify, well, you want to be out there when you're likely to find the stars, right? You want to be out there when the bulbils are most likely to be found. And in some lakes, we see the stars all summer long. But I find most reliably, middle to late summer is the easiest and most common time to find the stars attached. And remember, as I mentioned before, the stars tend to be on the underside of the algae. So if you're sampling, you want to get down and in towards the sediment and pull up a whole nice big clump of it and take a look to see if you find those stars. Sometimes the stars are actually right in the sediments. And so taking a good look and digging in and taking a look at what you have is the best and easiest time to find those stars. Because once you find those stars, you know definitively that you're dealing with starry stonewort. That's a really good question. Next slide, please. So now on to the fourth plant on our list. This is Hydrilla. Hydrilla is in some ways known as, a superweed in that it is a very aggressive grower. Very recently, a new updated map of the extent of Hydrilla was produced by the USGS, and you can see that in the lower left corner. Somehow, we've been lucky here in Michigan, and Hydrilla has not been found or reported in our lakes. However, it's all around us. You can see the other Great Lakes states all report Hydrilla, including in watersheds that feed directly into Lake Erie and Lake Michigan. And so, this is something that we want people to be very vigilant about and to be aware of, to report it very soon. If they do see it or even suspect it. We'd rather have a false report that we're able to determine was actually not Hydrilla than for someone to think, oh, I'm not sure if this is Hydrilla. I don't want to bother anyone. We want you to bother us. If you think you might have Hydrilla, please let us know. You can see some of the characteristics of Hydrilla here. It is, again, a ropey plant with whorls of leaves. These leaves are simple leaves. They're not branched like on a milfoil or any of those lookalikes we looked at before. There's a whorl of 4 to 8 leaves around the stem, and interestingly, just like curly leaf pondweed, the leaf edges are serrated, and that's an important characteristic, as you'll see, to determine it from some of our native plants that look alike. A key part about those teeth is that they're not only on the edges of the leaves, but you'll also see them on the underside of the leaves along the mid vein. So on the far right image there where the cursor is moving, you can see those teeth that grow on the underneath. So you can imagine maybe if you're handling this plant, it's likely to feel rough in your hands because of all those little teeth all over the leaves, and it certainly does. Next slide, please. All right, so given what you just learned, you can ask yourself, is this Hydrilla? It certainly looks a lot like the photo we just saw. You see the long stem, you see whorls of leaves at nodes along the stem, but then we look a little bit closer, and the first thing we notice is, what does that whorl of leaves look like? You can see there's only 3 leaves in the whorl, not 4 to 8, and there's no apparent teeth on the edges of the leaves. I know you can't see the underside to look at the midvein, but these leaves are smooth. So that's good news. This is not invasive Hydrilla. It's actually a native plant known as Elodea or waterweed that many of you have seen. It's also commonly sold in the aquarium trade. Native Elodea is. Next slide. Here you can see for comparison a whorl of leaves from Hydrilla. Notice that there are 5 leaves in the whorl, so that falls within the 4 to 8 range, and you can see the teeth. Next slide, please. Here's a really nice comparison side by side. Again, just kind of reinforcing what we just talked about. Hydrilla there on the left, 4 or more leaves at each node, clear teeth obvious on the leaf, including on the edges and the midbane, while Elodea tends to only have 3 leaves at each node, and the leaves tend to be much smoother. There is a note on here that they may have teeth if you looked under a microscope, but when you're out in the field, you won't be able to see any teeth on Elodea. And here's a great example again, hydrilla. Sometimes this is an interesting comparison because in this case, we've got a hydrilla that's growing with skinnier leaves, but if you look real close, there's still teeth on the edges there, and there's 5 leaves in each whorl as compared to 3. Next slide. All right, now we're moving on to the final plant in our list, European frogbit. And this is definitely a newer threat in Michigan. As you can read here, it was first discovered in 1996 in southeast Michigan, down in the Detroit area, along kind of the Lake Huron and Lake St. Clair area. And now you can see the counties where it has been found. It is spreading. It's kind of leapt and leapfrogged over from the Lake Huron side over to the Lake Michigan side. We've had a few occurrences in inland lakes near Grand Rapids, recently found at the mouth of the Grand River in Grand Haven, also Pentwater Lake. So we're quite positive this is being moved by boats on trailers. There may be other things moving it around too, but it's definitely something we want people to be on the eye, have their eye out for. It's a high threat and it's spreading really quickly. Next slide, please. So here's a really nice illustration of frogbit. It's a floating leaf plant, and it really kind of looks like a really cute mini water lily. So it's got these little heart-shaped leaves, but they're small. They don't get bigger than 2 or 3 inches across, so way smaller than our typical lily pads that we're used to seeing around Michigan. It's going to float freely in the water, and the roots will hang below, but they won't be rooted. Sometimes it grows in really shallow water, and those hanging roots will get tangled in the silt in the bottom just because the water is only a couple inches deep. But it's unlike our lily pads that have those long stems and big heavy roots down in the sediments of the lake. The small heart-shaped leaves, and also has a small white flower with 3 petals and a yellow center. Again, you can see a map of how it's kind of moved down towards Michigan and is appearing in more and more locations. Next slide, please. This image is really interesting because it shows an actual frogbit infestation. You can see cattail growing there in the background, and then the little tiny stuff that you can see indicated as European frogbit. That's our invasive frogbit. Because it's free floating, it does tend to wash and drift up against shorelines, up against cattails or other emergent plants, and pile up there because the wind blows it there. But you can also see for comparison how much smaller it is to the leaves of the white water lilies in the foreground. It's quite a bit smaller. So it does require kind of getting in there, getting into the edges, sometimes even wetland areas of a lake to look for it. And so that gives you a sense of the scale. Next slide, please. All right, it's time to ask yourself some questions. So we've got 2 different plants here. We're curious to know if you think either of these are European frogbit. So looking at the one on the left, you go, okay, I've got a heart-shaped leaf here. Actually, it kind of looks a little bit like Pac-Man. And so, but I'm also looking at that ruler on the sheet there. That's showing me that this plant is about 8 inches across its leaf. That's way too big to be European frogbit. This leaf is actually white water lily. White water lily has leaves that make it look like Pac-Man. The plant on the right, same thing. Am I dealing with European frogbit? Well, let's see. It's got kind of a heart-shaped leaf, but again, I'm looking at that ruler and it's way too big to be European frogbit. And also the flower's all wrong. If you remember, European frogbit has little white flowers with 3 petals and a small yellow center. This is definitely not European frogbit. This is actually yellow water lily, also known as spatterdock. I saw a question in the chat asking what the adverse impact of frog bit is. We don't have that photo here, but we have photos. European frog bit will make a mat, a dense mat on the surface of the water, and it will shade out any other native plants from below. Anything that's growing there will get shaded out, any native plants that our fish and our invertebrates rely on. So that's a great question. Finally, one more question, or two more actually. These plants, are they European frog bit? If we look at the one on the left, look at the shape of the leaf. Well, it's not as big as the ones we were just looking at, maybe an inch or so across, but it's not heart-shaped. There's no notch in this leaf. There's a stem coming off the side of it. Yeah, no heart-shaped leaf there. That is not European frog bit. And then it's actually a native pondweed. And then if you look at the plant on the right, is that European frog bit? Look at that leaf shape. It's not heart-shaped. That's an entire oval, no notch in it that makes it heart-shaped. And so no, that's not European frog bit. That's actually our native water shield. All right, next slide, please. There was a question previously in the chat about parrot feather, which was a great one. This list that we're showing here is the list of aquatic invaders that the state of Michigan has created that are their watch list plants. And these are plants that are either not been reported in Michigan before, but may appear in Michigan because they've been found in surrounding regions, or they've only been found in very rare cases in Michigan, maybe at the location of a aquarium dump or something like that. And so you'll see frogbit is still on that list, even though it's become a little more common in Michigan. But the rest of these are all plants that are outside of the Exotic Aquatic Plant Watch. However, if you find them or you suspect you may have found them, please let us know. And these include plants like hydrilla. Brazilian elodea is another plant that might look somewhat like hydrilla. Water chestnut has not been found in Michigan yet, but it's one that we're keeping an eye out for. So this list is available at the state website. We can also send them out to people at michigan.gov/invasives. You can download a copy for yourself there as well. Next slide, please. Finally, in addition to this training that you've all enjoyed today, a couple of years ago, we made a really nice YouTube video about this program. It talks about the Exotic Aquatic Plant Watch, why we're doing it, and also how to do it. We walk you through the protocol. Right there, you'll be right out on the boat with us while we're doing some surveying, and we'll also walk you through the identification of the plants in the Plant Watch, with the exception of frogbit, because this video was made before we added frogbit to the program. But this is a really useful video. You can see there's a link there that'll get you there if you want to write it down. We also put it in the chat at the beginning, so you can go there and visit and look for it and watch it at any time. It's it's only about 10 minutes or so long, so it's a nice refresher even if you've sat in on this training to have as a reference. There was a question on the side about whether hydrilla grows to the surface or how deep. Yes and very are the quick answers there. Hydrilla will grow to the surface. Hydrilla will grow in quite deep water. I don't have the figures right in front of me right now, but I know that I'm quite positive it'll grow in 10 to 15 feet of water without much problem. It might not get to the surface in that depth, but it's a really aggressive plant and will certainly mat at the surface in particular conditions. So yeah, at this point we have a few minutes left. I know we were scheduled to go till 2:30, but we can take any other questions through the chat that you might have. In the meantime, here is our contact information, phone numbers and email addresses for both Eric and I, and we're happy to correspond with you about this after the fact as well. Remember, if you're interested in signing up for the Exotic Aquatic Plant Watch this year, we'd like you to contact us just so we can keep you on our list and stay in touch with you through this course of the season. But we can also take questions now too. Thank you all for joining us today. It's been fun chatting with you and seeing the large number of people that showed up for this today.
All right, while we're waiting for people to submit questions, if you have any, I just wanted to take a moment and thank Joe and Eric both for joining us today, for providing this training. We all know how much time we are spending at home right now, so it's nice to have it now during this time of being at home. And Michigan Lakes and Streams Association, again, is certainly disappointed that we will not have our conference this year, but we are working on some other options, so stay tuned. We will have some other sessions for you. It looks like Ralph says all aquatic macrophytes that flower grow to the surface. Okay, so that's in response to the hydrilla question. Eric apologizes for his poor internet. We're sorry too, Eric, because we know that you prepared very well for this.
Well, I know exactly why he's having problems. If he wasn't underwater in all that native milfoil, he would actually be able to hear him.
We actually have another session we're going to run next Friday. We will have Julia Kirkwood from Eagle, the non-point source presentation, or the non-point source program of Eagle. She is going to be talking about natural shorelines, so we're excited about that. And we have some other things set up as well that we will get out to you. So we're really, really happy to have this alternate option. All right, and Bruce is asking about accessing the slides, which we will make sure we put with the recording of the session as well. We'll put both of those things together. And Andy says, are you familiar with adverse impacts on fish directly from aquatic herbicide treatments?
Well, that question goes way beyond what we were talking about today, but there's a quick response to that is that herbicides definitely, as you can imagine, go through tons and tons of testing before they're approved for use, either by the EPA, and then they have to be approved by the state of Michigan for use in our waters. And so that's a really important question to think about. But in general, in order to be approved, there can't be adverse impacts known on herbicides to fish communities in lakes. So as long as herbicides are applied in consistent with the way they are labeled for legal use, in general, the impacts to the fish community can be minimal. Sometimes we can see impacts, for example, if there's a very plant-heavy lake and a lot of plant material has been killed through herbicides or other means. Sometimes the amount of decomposition from that much plant material decomposing in the bottom of a lake can use up oxygen, and in some cases that may cause stress on fish. So that's one example of where you may see some stresses occur, and Eric might have other things to add to that response.
Hope you hit it with the dissolved oxygen that can occur under some circumstances. And then I guess the only other thing is sometimes some invaded lakes, the only plant present is an invasive plant. And so if you remove that plant, even if it's bad, there's still benefits to having plants as habitat. And so you have to think, if you remove the habitat, that could have an adverse impact on spawning or feeding behaviors. So that's the other one.
Another thing I'll mention is we were talking about sharing this presentation. I know Melissa is going to be making available the link to watching this recording. Someone asked about the slides specifically, if you just wanted the file. Melissa, what we can do is we can provide you with a PDF of our slides. So if people just want that file and want to look at it or print it out or something, it won't have the audio obviously, but if they just want the images, we'll provide that to you too, Melissa, so you can send it out.
Okay, that's great. And someone is asking for the Zoom information for next week, and I'm going to put that in the chat for everyone, if you are interested in that. Okay, and let's see. Make sure I didn't miss any more questions. So yeah, so please plan to join us for more of these. Michigan Lakes and Streams Association thanks Eric and Joe for their presentation. We will share the recording as well as the the PDF of the PowerPoint. And, you know, Michigan Lakes and Streams appreciates your participation. We hope that you will join us again, and, you know, always looking for partners and new members to help us continue to do things like this. So thank you all. And we hope you have a wonderful weekend. Stay healthy.